All right, so today we're going to take a deep dive into Lindsay's Facebook posts about this whole Mulberry lawsuit. It's a lot, but that's what we do here, try to break it down.
Yeah, we'll unpack it.
Exactly. So we've got, like, this collection of her posts, right? And audio clips and even screenshots all about this legal fight over the city of Mulberry. And one thing that really jumps out is Lindsay's frustration. Like, she is really convinced there's corruption happening, even though we don't see any hard evidence of that in the actual court documents. She keeps calling out Gwinnett County's lead attorney, Michael Ludwigczak, and Commissioner Matthew Holtkamp. And she's not subtle about it. She uses phrases like unethical business practices when talking about Ludwigczak. And she even started a petition to get him to resign.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty intense. And it's not just the words she uses. It's the way she presents the information. It's all these snippets of audio from meetings, images, and yeah, it just creates this really fragmented picture.
Like puzzle pieces, but without the box top to show us what the full picture is supposed to look like.
Exactly. For example, in one post, she shared the screenshot of a quote from SB 333, the bill that created Mulberry in the first place. She highlights the part that says the city would not be allowed to implement a city property tax. And her caption is just, "A promise is a promise." But then, like a few posts later, she shares an audio clip from a town hall meeting where the possibility of future property taxes was mentioned. But she zooms in on that possibility without giving any context or mentioning the explanations that were offered during the actual meeting. So it's like, okay, what's the story here? Why this kind of like disjointed approach to the information?
Yeah, it's a bit of a head scratcher, right? You know, what's interesting to me is that this piecemeal approach can actually make it harder for anyone who's not already following the saga really closely to understand what's going on. It's like trying to figure out a movie by only watching random scenes out of order.
Oh, totally. You get bits and pieces, but no real understanding of the plot.
Exactly. And I think it's important to remember that Lindsay is very clearly coming at this from a pro-Mulberry perspective. You know, she's likely really invested in the city's success and probably feels betrayed by anything that looks like a broken promise or an obstacle in the city's way.
Like that vision she bought into isn't panning out how she expected.
Right. And that sense of betrayal, especially if it's tied to something she cares about deeply, could be fueling her anger and leading her to seek out information that validates her suspicions.
Yeah, like that confirmation bias thing where we focus on things that support what we already believe.
Exactly. And that can be really powerful, especially with complicated issues like this lawsuit, where there's so much information to sift through.
It's easy to get lost in the weeds.
It is. And if she's mainly getting her information from sources that share her viewpoint, it creates that echo chamber effect, which just amplifies those feelings of anger and injustice.
And when you add in the frustration of feeling like your concerns aren't being heard or taken seriously, it's not surprising that Lindsay's posts get so, well, emotionally charged.
Yeah, definitely.
She's using really strong language, making some pretty serious accusations, and presenting things in a way that's meant to get a strong reaction from her audience. It's like she's trying to rally support for her cause, to get people as fired up about this as she is.
I think you're right, and that's where those out-of-context clips and fragmented narratives can be effective because they create that sense of urgency, that feeling that something's wrong and needs to be fixed now.
Like a call to action.
Exactly. It's a common tactic, especially in politics, you know, to mobilize supporters.
And to make the other side look bad.
Right. But it can backfire too, because making accusations without solid evidence can actually damage your credibility and make it harder to have productive conversations.
Yeah, especially in a situation like this lawsuit where clear communication is so important.
Absolutely. It could actually hurt Lindsay's efforts to advocate for Mulberry in the long run.
So it's a tricky balance.
It is.
Being passionate and advocating for what you believe in is important, but it needs to be based on facts and presented in a way that encourages understanding and dialogue.
Otherwise, the message can get lost in all the noise.
Exactly. And I think we see this tension playing out in a lot of Lindsay's posts. She's clearly passionate about Mulberry and wants to see it succeed, but her approach to sharing information might not be the most effective way to achieve her goals.
Right, and that's something we'll keep exploring as we dive deeper into her posts and try to understand the bigger picture of this lawsuit.
Okay, so let's look at a specific example that shows Lindsay's frustration and how she uses these fragmented narratives. She posted this audio clip of a phone call she had with Commissioner Holtkamp, and it's pretty revealing.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. You can hear Lindsay's anger and frustration, especially when she talks about Ludwigczak. She accuses him of setting Holtkamp up for failure and claims she has proof of secret meetings and documents that support her claims. She even warns Holtkamp that he's losing credibility by being associated with Ludwigszak. It's like she's trying to, I don't know, like warn him, get him to see Ludwigszak as the bad guy she believes he is.
Yeah, it goes back to that confirmation bias we talked about. If she's already convinced Ludwigszak is corrupt, she's likely to interpret anything he does through that lens, even if there are other explanations.
Right, like she's looking for evidence to confirm what she already believes, rather than being open to other possibilities.
Exactly. And we have to remember, we're only getting Lindsay's side of things. We don't know Ludwigszak's motivations or if there are perfectly legitimate reasons for his actions that Lindsay might not know about or might be choosing to ignore.
It's like a puzzle with missing pieces.
It is. It's also possible she's misinterpreting things or jumping to conclusions based on incomplete information.
But even if her accusations aren't completely accurate, her perspective is still important.
Oh, absolutely.
It gives us a window into the worries and frustrations that some Mulberry supporters are feeling.
It also highlights how important transparency and communication are from people in positions of authority, especially with sensitive and complicated issues like this lawsuit.
Totally. So, by understanding where Lindsay is coming from, we can start to unravel the bigger dynamics at play here. What's causing this anger and distrust? What role is misinformation or confirmation bias playing? And how can we encourage a more productive conversation about all this? One that's focused on solutions and not just accusations.
Those are the big questions, aren't they?
They are. And those are the questions we'll keep exploring as we go through more of Lindsay's Facebook posts and try to understand the Mulberry lawsuit. It's a fascinating look at how information is shared, how we form our perceptions, and how individual voices can amplify both truth and misinformation. It reminds us that even with all the ways we can communicate instantly and through social media, understanding what's really going on requires careful thought, critical thinking, and being open to multiple perspectives.
Well said.
And that's exactly what we're going to do in this deep dive, so buckle up because this is about to get really interesting.
I can't wait.
So we've seen that Lindsay is really suspicious of the county and what they're doing, especially when it comes to Ludwigszak. But it's not just about him. Her Facebook posts also show this deep worry about transparency and accountability, like with the county government in general.
Interesting.
Yeah. She's constantly criticizing how Gwinnett County handles development projects, particularly this one called Pool Mountain. It's almost like she sees this Pool Mountain thing and the Mulberry lawsuit as, like, connected somehow.
Like two sides of the same coin.
Exactly. Both seem to be, in her view, examples of this lack of transparency and accountability that she keeps talking about.
I see.
She's especially critical of the developer for Pool Mountain, Drayak, accusing them of being negligent and ignoring environmental rules. She brings up stuff about land disturbance, how stormwater is managed, and the potential impact on the Mulberry River. And she connects those environmental concerns to this bigger fight over how much control Mulberry has. Like, she believes that the same people trying to limit Mulberry's power are also the ones letting this irresponsible development happen.
So she's weaving together these different issues, right? Creating this narrative that links environmental concerns, local control, and these accusations of corruption.
Exactly. And it's all fueled by this belief that the county government is siding with powerful interests, like these developers, over the concerns of regular people.
That sense of a rigged system.
Yeah.
It's a powerful motivator.
It really is. She's not just raising concerns. She's like sounding an alarm.
Trying to wake people up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where those out-of-context clips and emotionally charged language come in.
To grab attention, make people feel that urgency.
Exactly.
Which makes sense, right? When you feel like something important is being threatened, when you see those in power making decisions you think are harmful, it's natural to want to fight back, speak up, and demand to be heard.
Absolutely.
And that's what Lindsay is doing.
She's using her platform to challenge the status quo, to expose what she sees as wrongdoing, and to rally support for her cause.
And whether her accusations are completely accurate or not, you can't deny her passion and persistence.
Yeah, that's what makes this whole thing so interesting. It reminds us that even in a seemingly simple legal case, there are all these layers of complexity, competing interests, and strong beliefs involved.
And that the fight for justice, or at least what someone perceives as justice, can be messy and unpredictable.
Definitely.
And it shows how individual voices, amplified through social media and grassroots activism, can actually have a real impact on how things play out.
All right, so we've heard Lindsay's perspective, but what about the county's response to all of this?
Well, their legal team is basically arguing that SB 333, the law that created Mulberry, is totally valid. They're saying the state legislature has the power to create new cities and set some rules for how they operate, as long as those rules are reasonable and don't clash with the bigger idea of local control.
So they're not denying that the state was involved in shaping Mulberry, but they're saying it was all within their rights.
Exactly. They're also emphasizing that the limitations placed on Mulberry's power were included in SB 333 to reflect what the voters wanted. They point to all the stuff before the vote, like campaign materials and town hall discussions, that presented Mulberry as a limited government with no property taxes and a focus on specific services.
So their argument hinges on this idea that these limitations were part of the deal the voters agreed to.
Right.
But as we've seen, Lindsay and others are saying those promises were based on misleading information and that the voters didn't really grasp the long-term implications.
Yeah, that's where things get sticky.
It does, because it raises the question of whether a vote can be truly informed if the information given to voters was incomplete or presented in a way that hid the potential consequences.
Right. It's complicated.
It is.
And it reminds us that even though the democratic process is essential, it's not always perfect. It can be manipulated, influenced by powerful interests, and susceptible to misinformation.
So we all have to be informed and engaged citizens, right? We need to scrutinize the information we're given and hold those in power accountable.
Absolutely.
Now let's look at a specific part of the lawsuit that really highlights this tension between the state's power and local control. Hughes, the guy who filed the suit, is challenging the limitations that SB 333 puts on Mulberry's ability to impose property taxes.
Interesting.
Yeah. He's arguing that the Georgia Constitution gives towns the right to levy taxes, and that SB 333, being a local law, doesn't have the power to restrict that right. He's basically saying the state went too far by trying to limit Mulberry's taxing power with a law that only applies to that specific city.
I see.
And he also argues that the mandatory language in SB 333, which forces Mulberry to provide services like zoning and code enforcement, violates the idea of home rule. Yeah, it's this concept in Georgia that gives cities and counties a certain amount of freedom to govern themselves. Hughes is saying these services, while they're usually given to cities under the Georgia Constitution, are supposed to be optional. Cities can choose whether or not to handle them.
Okay.
But by forcing Mulberry to provide these services, SB 333, according to Hughes, takes away that local choice.
So it's like the state is saying, you can be a city, but only if you do things our way.
Exactly. And that's something Lindsay brings up again and again in her Facebook posts. She sees these limitations as an attack on Mulberry's independence, like an attempt to control the city and prevent it from really governing itself.
And her anger about that is pretty clear, especially in that phone call with Holtkamp.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
She feels betrayed by the county government, the very entity that's supposed to be supporting its cities.
And she's not holding back in expressing that anger, calling out those she believes are responsible and demanding they be held accountable.
No, not at all. And that's what makes this story so compelling, right? It shows how these big ideas of government and autonomy play out in the real world, with real consequences for people's lives.
It's not just some theoretical debate happening in a courtroom. It's a real struggle that's affecting people's lives.
Exactly.
And it highlights how important these legal battles are for the future of local control, not just in Mulberry, but in the whole state.
Okay, so now let's zoom in on another key part of this legal fight. Hughes is also challenging the process that led to Mulberry's incorporation in the first place. He's arguing that the voters weren't properly informed about the consequences of SB 333, especially about the limits it would put on the city's powers.
So he's saying the whole foundation of Mulberry, the way it was created, might be shaky?
Right.
That's a pretty big deal.
It is. If the court agrees with him and finds that the information given to voters was misleading or incomplete, it could potentially invalidate the entire process that created Mulberry.
So the city would basically cease to exist legally?
Yeah, potentially.
Wow, that would be huge.
It would. It would raise all sorts of complicated legal and logistical questions about how to handle the situation.
Yeah.
It might even mean undoing everything that's been done since Mulberry was created, like appointing interim officials and setting up its government structure.
And I imagine it would cause a lot of confusion and frustration for the people who voted to create the city in the first place.
For sure.
It really emphasizes how important it is for voters to have accurate and complete information.
Absolutely.
The whole legitimacy of the process rests on that idea.
And that's exactly what Lindsay is so worried about. She believes the process was flawed from the start, that voters were manipulated, and that the county is now trying to hide what they did. Her Facebook posts are full of accusations about secret deals, hidden motives, and a deliberate attempt to trick the public.
And she sees Ludwigczak as the one orchestrating all of it.
Yep.
It's a reminder that transparency and accountability in government are crucial, especially when it comes to decisions that have such big consequences for people's lives.
Couldn't agree more. So let's look at a specific example of how Lindsay uses her Facebook posts to highlight what she sees as wrongdoing and to rally support. In one post, she shares a screenshot of a legal document about the Pool Mountain development, highlighting a section on environmental regulations. And then she adds her own comments, accusing the developer of breaking those rules and the county of ignoring it. She uses bold text and exclamation points to really emphasize her points and get people riled up.
It's a common tactic online, right? To try and draw attention to issues that you feel are being ignored or downplayed.
Exactly.
And it can be effective in mobilizing people and putting pressure on those in power.
It can. But we also have to remember that social media posts, while they can be powerful tools, aren't always reliable sources of information.
Right. They can be biased, lack context, and present an incomplete picture.
Absolutely.
So it's important to be critical of what we see online, to double-check information whenever possible, and to look for different perspectives before making up our minds.
Good advice. Okay, so in another post, Lindsay shares an audio clip from a town hall meeting where county officials are talking about the Mulberry lawsuit.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, but she focuses on one specific comment from Ludwigczak and takes it out of context to make it sound like he's admitting to something shady.
Oh, wow.
And then she adds her own commentary, accusing him of lying and intentionally misleading the public.
That's a pretty serious accusation.
It is.
It highlights how social media can be used to twist information and influence public perception.
Yeah, by carefully choosing what to share and how to present it, you can create a narrative that's very different from reality.
Exactly. Which is why it's so important to be media literate, to understand how information can be manipulated, and to be skeptical of sources that seem biased or one-sided.
Absolutely. Now, the county is denying all these accusations of wrongdoing. They're saying their actions have been legal and transparent and that they followed all the proper procedures. They keep emphasizing that their decisions about Mulberry were all about serving the best interests of the whole community.
But it sounds like Lindsay and others aren't buying it.
Nope. They see a pattern of behavior that suggests a lack of transparency and a disregard for the concerns of anyone who disagrees with the county. And they're not giving up. They're using their voices and platforms to demand accountability and to make sure the will of the people is actually represented in the decisions that shape their communities.
That's powerful.
It is. So let's switch gears and look at the legal arguments being made in the lawsuit itself.
Yeah.
We've heard Lindsay's perspective and the county's response, but what about the specific legal challenges Hughes is making?
Okay, let's break those down.
His arguments focus on a few key parts of SB 333, particularly the limits it puts on Mulberry's ability to impose taxes and the requirement that the city provide certain services.
Right.
He claims these parts of the law violate the home rule provisions of the Georgia Constitution, which, as we said, gives cities and counties a certain level of autonomy.
Okay.
He's saying SB 333 oversteps those boundaries by dictating how Mulberry should operate. And he's especially bothered by the fact that SB 333 restricts Mulberry's ability to impose property taxes and forces it to provide services like zoning and code enforcement.
He sees that as an infringement on the city's right to govern itself.
Exactly. It's like the state is saying, we'll let you be a city, but only on our terms.
And again, that's a point Lindsay keeps hammering in her Facebook posts.
Yeah, she sees these limitations as an attack on Mulberry's independence, an attempt to control the city and keep it from truly running its own affairs.
And her frustration with that is palpable, especially in that phone call with Holtkamp.
Oh, absolutely. She feels like the county government, which should be supporting its cities, has betrayed her.
And she's not afraid to express that anger, to call out those she believes are responsible, and to demand they be held accountable.
No, not at all. Now, the county's lawyers are fighting back against these arguments. They're saying the things included in SB 333 are just a reflection of what the voters who approved Mulberry's creation wanted.
So they're saying these limitations were part of the deal voters agreed to. But Hughes is arguing that those promises were based on misleading information and that the voters weren't fully aware of what SB 333 would really mean.
Right. He's saying the limits on the city's power are actually hurting its success.
And that gets right to the heart of this whole debate over home rule. How much freedom should a city have to govern itself? And what role should the state play in deciding how its cities are structured and what powers they have?
Big questions.
They are. They've been debated for centuries in the U.S.
But what's interesting about this Mulberry lawsuit is that it brings those abstract ideas of government and autonomy to life. It's not just a theoretical argument, it's a real struggle with real consequences for the people living in Mulberry and for the future of local control in Georgia.
Right. It's a reminder that these legal battles are not just about laws and precedents. They're about people's lives and the communities they care about.
Absolutely.
And it also shows how important citizen activism is.
Like what Lindsay is doing.
Exactly. She's using her voice to demand transparency, accountability, and a government that truly represents the will of the people.
All right, so now let's look at another key aspect of this legal battle. Hughes is also challenging the process that led to Mulberry's incorporation. He's arguing that voters weren't given enough information about the implications of SB 333, particularly about how it would limit the city's powers.
So he's basically saying that the whole process that created Mulberry was flawed.
Right.
That's a pretty serious claim.
It is, because if the court agrees with him and finds that the information given to voters was misleading or incomplete, it could potentially invalidate the entire process that led to Mulberry's creation.
Wow, so the city would basically cease to exist legally.
Yeah, potentially.
That would be a huge development.
It would raise all sorts of complicated legal and logistical questions about what to do next.
Like, would they have to undo everything that's been done since Mulberry was incorporated?
Potentially, yeah.
And what about the people who voted for the city's creation? Would their votes be considered invalid?
It's a messy situation. And it highlights how important it is that voters are given accurate and complete information so they can make informed decisions.
Absolutely. The entire legitimacy of the process hinges on that.
And this is exactly what Lindsay is so worried about. She believes the process was messed up from the very beginning, that voters were manipulated, and that the county government is now trying to cover up their actions.
And her Facebook posts are full of accusations about backroom deals, hidden agendas, and a deliberate effort to deceive the public.
Exactly.
It's a reminder that we need to be vigilant, question authority, and hold those in power accountable for their actions.
Now, let's look at a specific example of how Lindsay uses her Facebook posts to expose what she sees as wrongdoing and rally support for her cause. In one post, she shares a screenshot of a legal document related to the Pool Mountain subdivision, highlighting a section about environmental regulations. Then she adds her own commentary, accusing the developer of breaking those regulations and the county of looking the other way. She uses bold text and exclamation points to emphasize her points and evoke a sense of outrage.
It's a tactic that's often used by online activists to draw attention to issues they feel are being ignored.
Right.
And it can be pretty effective in mobilizing supporters and putting pressure on those in power.
It can. But it's important to remember that social media posts, while they can be great for raising awareness, aren't always the most reliable sources of information.
Right. They can be biased, lacking context, and only tell part of the story.
Exactly.
So it's crucial to approach them with a critical eye, check the information whenever you can, and look for different perspectives to get a more complete picture.
Now, in another Facebook post, Lindsay shares an audio clip from a town hall meeting where county officials are discussing the Mulberry lawsuit.
Okay.
She zeroes in on a specific comment made by Ludwitsak, taking it out of context to make it seem like he's admitting to doing something wrong. Then she adds her own commentary, accusing him of lying and deliberately misleading the public.
That's a serious accusation.
It is.
It really highlights how social media can be used to manipulate information and shape how people perceive things.
Yeah, by carefully selecting what to share and how to present it, it's possible to create a narrative that's very different from what actually happened.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to be media literate, to understand how information can be distorted, and to be wary of sources that seem overly biased.
Now, the county is pushing back against these accusations, saying they've done nothing wrong. They're claiming their actions have been legal and transparent and that they've followed all the rules.
Right. And they're saying their decisions about Mulberry were all about doing what's best for the community as a whole.
But Lindsay and others aren't convinced.
They're seeing a pattern of behavior that doesn't sit right with them.
Exactly.
A lack of transparency and a disregard for the concerns of those who disagree with them.
And they're determined to keep fighting, using their voices and their platforms to demand accountability and make sure the will of the people is actually represented in the decisions that affect their lives.
It's a powerful reminder that even in a seemingly simple legal case, there can be so much more going on beneath the surface.
Absolutely.
Competing interests, conflicting narratives, and deep-seated beliefs about how power should be wielded and who should benefit.
Okay, so now let's dive into the legal arguments being made in the lawsuit itself. We've heard Lindsay's side and the county's response, but what about the specific challenges Hughes is raising?
Let's unpack those.
Well, his arguments focus on a few key parts of SB 333. Mainly the limits it puts on Mulberry's ability to collect taxes and the requirement that the city provide certain services. He claims these parts of the law go against the home rule provisions in the Georgia Constitution, which are meant to give cities and counties some freedom to govern themselves.
So he's saying the state is overstepping its bounds.
Exactly. He argues that SB 333 goes too far in dictating how Mulberry should operate.
And specifically, he takes issue with the restrictions on Mulberry's ability to impose property taxes.
Right. He points to the Georgia Constitution, which allows municipalities to levy taxes as permitted by the state constitution or by general law. And he's saying that SB 333, as a local law, doesn't have the authority to limit that power.
So he's essentially arguing that the state legislature is trying to bypass the normal procedures for limiting a municipality's taxing powers by using a local law that only applies to Mulberry.
Exactly. And he also argues that forcing Mulberry to provide services like zoning, code enforcement, and stormwater management goes against the concept of home rule. These services, although they're usually given to cities under the Georgia Constitution, are supposed to be optional. Cities can choose whether or not to handle them.
But SB 333 takes away that choice from Mulberry.
Exactly.
It's like the state is saying, you can be a city, but only if you play by our rules.
And this is something Lindsay keeps emphasizing in her Facebook posts. She sees these limitations as an attack on Mulberry's independence, an attempt to control the city and prevent it from truly governing itself.
And her anger about that is pretty evident, especially in that phone call with Holtkamp.
Yeah, she feels betrayed by the county government, the entity that's supposed to support its cities.
And she's not holding back in expressing her anger, calling out those she believes are responsible, and demanding accountability.
Now, the county's legal team is pushing back, saying that the things included in SB 3333 are just a reflection of what the voters who approved Mulberry's creation wanted.
They're essentially arguing that these limitations were part of the agreement that the voters made when they voted to create the city.
Exactly. But Hughes argues that those promises were based on misleading information and that the voters didn't fully grasp what SB 333 would actually mean.
So he's saying the limitations on the city's powers are actually harmful to its success.
Right.
And that brings us back to the core of this whole home rule debate. How much autonomy should a city have, and what role should the state play in shaping how cities operate?
These are big questions.
They are, and they've been debated for centuries in this country.
But what's interesting about this Mulberry lawsuit is that it takes those big ideas and makes them real. It's not just a theoretical discussion happening in a courtroom. It's a real-life struggle with real consequences for the people who live in Mulberry and for the future of local control in Georgia.
It's a reminder that these legal battles aren't just about abstract principles, but about real people, real communities, and the future they're fighting for.
Yeah, exactly.
And it also shows how powerful citizen activism can be.
Like what Lindsay is doing.
Right. She's using her voice to demand transparency, accountability, and a government that genuinely reflects the will of the people.
All right, now let's shift our focus to another important aspect of this legal fight. Hughes is also challenging the actual process that led to Mulberry's incorporation. He's arguing that voters weren't given enough information about what SB 333 would really mean, especially about how it would limit the city's powers.
So he's essentially saying the whole process that brought Mulberry into existence was flawed.
Exactly.
And that's a pretty big deal.
It is. Because if the court sides with him and finds that the information provided to voters was misleading or incomplete, it could potentially invalidate the entire process that created Mulberry.
So Mulberry could essentially cease to exist legally.
Yeah, that's a possibility.
Wow, that would be huge.
It would. It would raise all sorts of complicated legal and logistical questions about how to untangle everything.
And what about the people who voted to create Mulberry?
Right. Their votes could potentially be seen as invalid.
It's a really messy situation.
It is. And it underscores how important it is that voters have access to accurate and complete information so they can make informed choices.
Absolutely. The legitimacy of the entire process hinges on that.
And this is what Lindsay is so worried about. She's convinced that the process was messed up from the start, that voters were manipulated, and that the county government is now trying to sweep everything under the rug.
Her Facebook posts are full of accusations about secret deals, hidden motives, and a deliberate attempt to deceive the public.
Exactly. She's convinced that there's more to the story than meets the eye, and she's trying to use her platform to expose it. It's important to remember that the county's lawyers are fighting Hughes' attempt to stop the election. They're saying it should go ahead as planned, emphasizing how important it is to respect the voters who wanted Mulberry to be created in the first place.
So they're arguing that delaying the election would be like silencing those voters and undermining the democratic process.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what about Hughes' argument that holding an election under a charter that might be unconstitutional could create even more legal problems later on? Are they addressing that at all?
Well, they might be trying to downplay that risk, suggesting that any potential issues can be sorted out once the city government is up and running.
Okay.
They might also be stressing how important it is to let Mulberry start functioning as a city as soon as possible, arguing that delaying the election would prevent it from providing services and meeting the needs of its residents.
So it's a balancing act, right? Respecting the results of the referendum versus dealing with potential legal challenges before they become a bigger problem.
It is, and the court has to weigh those competing priorities when deciding whether to grant Hughes' request to stop the election.
Meanwhile, Lindsay's taken a more proactive approach, trying to sway the outcome through public pressure.
Right.
It's clear in that phone call with Holtkamp. She keeps bringing up what she knows, dropping hints about the evidence she has, and warning him about what could happen if nothing's done. She's definitely trying to use what she knows to get him to do what she wants.
Yeah, I see that.
And she's laser-focused on Ludwigczak, urging Holtkamp to distance himself from the county attorney and recognize the harm he's causing. She tells him, Lezak is y'all's problem. He is setting you up for failure. She clearly sees Ludwigczak as a liability and believes he's acting unethically, maybe even for personal gain. And she even hints that she has proof of this bad behavior, but she doesn't give specifics in the phone call.
So it's almost like she's trying to tempt Holtkamp to get him to come to her for more information.
Yeah, it's a bold move.
It is, but it fits with what we've seen of Lindsay's personality and how she approaches activism. She's not afraid to make big accusations and put pressure on those in power, even if it means making enemies or facing consequences.
It definitely adds another layer of intrigue to the whole situation.
It does, and it reminds us that these legal fights don't just play out in courtrooms, they also play out in the public eye.
So to understand the legal side of things a bit better, it's helpful to look beyond this specific case and consider the bigger picture of how cities are governed in Georgia. Can you give us a quick rundown of the laws that determine how new cities are created and how power is divided between the state and its cities?
Sure. In Georgia, the power to create a new city rests entirely with the state legislature. The process usually involves creating a charter, which is basically a document that defines the city's boundaries, how its government is structured, and what powers it has.
So the legislature has a lot of control over how new cities are formed and how they operate.
Right.
But where are the limits? At what point does the state's power end and the city's right to govern itself begin?
That's a complicated question, and it's central to the whole argument in the Mulberry lawsuit. The home rule provisions in the Georgia Constitution, which we've talked about, give cities and counties a certain level of self-governance. They can make decisions about local matters without too much interference from the state.
Okay.
But the state still has ultimate authority, and the legislature can create general laws that apply to all cities, setting some basic rules for how they function.
So it's a balancing act between state oversight and local autonomy.
Exactly. And often it's the courts that have to settle disputes when those two principles clash.
Like in this case with Mulberry.
Right. The court will have to decide whether the limitations on Mulberry's powers in SB 333 are a legitimate use of state authority, or if they overstep the boundaries and violate the city's home rule rights.
And Lindsay seems pretty sure it's an overreach. She sees a pattern of the state meddling in Mulberry's affairs, trying to control the city and prevent it from really governing itself.
Right.
And that perception is strengthened by her belief that Ludwigczak is basically working for the state, carrying out this secret plan to undermine Mulberry's independence.
Whether that's true or not, it's clearly shaping how she sees the situation and driving her passionate advocacy.
For sure. It's a reminder that these legal battles aren't just about abstract legal concepts. They're also about deeply held beliefs, ideas about fairness, the complex ways in which power operates.
Absolutely.
So as this case continues, it'll be interesting to see how these competing narratives play out, how the court balances the interests of the state and the city, and whether Lindsay's efforts to expose what she sees as wrongdoing will have any impact on the final outcome.
It'll be fascinating to see how it all unfolds.
It will. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Lindsay's Facebook posts and the Mulberry lawsuit, it's clear that we've only scratched the surface of a really complex and evolving story. We're left with a lot of questions, some unease about the potential for abuses of power, and a renewed appreciation for the importance of citizens getting involved and holding those in power accountable.
Right. It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in shaping our communities and ensuring that our voices are heard.
Absolutely. So as this story continues to develop, we encourage you to stay informed, to question what you hear, and to engage in thoughtful conversations about the things that matter most to you.
It's through those conversations, through sharing ideas and searching for the truth, that we can create a more just and equitable society for everyone.
Well said. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another look at the intriguing world around us.
Until next time,